Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. My name is Tony Farrar, and I am your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 12, where we will be discussing terrorism and human trafficking. And we're going to look at a couple of different things. We're going to look at terrorism, the crime of treason, and define a word called sedition. And we'll look at some terrorism laws along with some constitutional issues. And then finally, we'll wrap everything up with human smuggling and trafficking of persons. So we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right into our Chapter 12 lecture for this evening. Of all crimes, terrorism has received the greatest attention in the past decade. And historically, terrorism has been a greater threat to those of other nations rather than those here in the United States. But I think we know that that's changing. So, beginning with the bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, in April of 1983, acts of violence against U.S. targets have brought terrorism to the center of American psyche, and we truly are thinking about these types of issues. And indeed, recent acts of terrorism, particularly the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, have led to the creation of new terrorism laws and a variety of new security practices at airports and power plants and water treatment facilities and other locations, and also increased private security and increased cooperation and information sharing between federal and state law enforcement and security agencies. Now, the changes have not only been extensive, but they've also been costly. It's estimated that the financial costs of 9/11 alone have exceeded $1 trillion. It's easy to imagine, for example, that the expense of hunting down Osama bin Laden ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So again, this lecture is going to explore two contemporary criminal law topics. The first is going to be terrorism and related crimes, and then the second is going to take a look at human smuggling and trafficking. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Terrorism is a crime against the public and could have been included back in Chapter 10, but really because of the significance of the subject matter, it's being discussed separately, not only in the textbook, but in this lecture as well. And as is true of other crimes against the public, the government may be the target, but individuals are harmed or murdered, and property is destroyed. So, regardless of the personal and property dimensions of the crime, which are separate chargeable offenses, the crime of terrorism is defined by its public nature. And terrorists intend, again, to harm or disrupt the government. They usually have political or ideological or religious intentions, and often have no regard for life or property. Now, some terrorists act on behalf of their governments, and others act on their own. And terrorism isn't some new thing. Terror has been used to influence governments and their citizens for ages. It often transcends national boundaries, and for this reason, terrorism is the subject of a considerable number of international as well as domestic laws. So Again, terrorism is a crime against the public. Terrorists intend to harm or disrupt government. They usually have political or ideological or religious intentions. And as mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, some act on behalf of their governments and others basically act on their own. So what's the definition? Well, your textbook definition describes terrorism as something, again, that has some political or ideological or religious intent. Let me give you the FBI's definition of terrorism. So, well, I'll give you the book definition. So the textbook definition: the commission of a traditional crime such as murder with the intention of coercing a population or influencing a government through fear or intimidation. Now, I'm showing you now the definition used by the FBI, and this is located within the Code of Federal Regulations, and it says as follows: terrorism includes the unlawful use of force or violence against any persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political objectives. So you can see some elements to the crime of terrorism that are consistent within both the textbook definition and the definition here that's used by the FBI. So with that being said, for this reason, again, terrorism is the subject of a considerable number of international as well as domestic laws. Now, terrorism is a lot of times divided into two different areas. It's international terrorism and domestic terrorism. So international terrorism is a foreign-based or directed by countries or groups outside of the United States against the United States. So domestic terrorism is based and operating entirely within the United States without some foreign direction. Now, a related crime that comes up in this, well, let me show you this real quick first before we get into that. What I've posted here for you is a link to a one-of-a-kind basic storybook, if you will, that maps out the San Bernardino terrorism incident. And this is the incident that occurred in downtown San Bernardino, and it kind of goes to show that this type of crime can happen anywhere. And not many people have access to this, so I really don't want you to show it to everybody. But I'm going to click on this link, and what a storyboard is, and I'm going to kind of move this over so you can see it here, is this will walk you through the entire San Bernardino incident. Now, you're only seeing part of the page because over here is cut off. But a storyboard basically talks about the incident. It tells you, it's going to walk you through the whole thing from start to finish. And it will even have like a video. So as you go through each piece, if you will, of this, it's going to give you information about what's happening along with the video or along with audio. So here you can see different videos that you can click on, and again, it's going to walk you through this entire story. So this is going to be a very valuable experience for each one of you to look at as we're discussing terrorism, or if you're just interested in these types of events that take place. So take the time to go through that. And in your textbook on page 12, you can see a table that has recent acts of terrorism against the United States. And it's not totally up to date, of course, because there have been some other ones that aren't listed, like the incident in San Bernardino, and then the mass shooting, if you will, that was in Las Vegas not too long ago. But I wanted to make sure that you got to see this so you can see some of the different things that have taken place throughout the last decade. So, a related crime is a crime called treason. And this is the only crime mentioned in the Constitution of the United States. So Article 3, Section 3 provides that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. Now that's a quote, and it talks about the crime of treason. So treason is the crime, again, of levying war against or supporting the enemy of one's nation. Now, some points of reference that we need to understand under that. This is the only crime specifically mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, and few have been convicted of this type of offense. And partially the reason for that is because there must be 2 witnesses to the same overt act, which is a significant hurdle for prosecutors if you're going to prosecute this type of case. So for treason to be a crime, it simply defines what acts may be declared treasonous by legislation, and again requires those 2 witnesses or a confession to prove it. And as discussed in Chapter 10, if you remember, it is a federal statute that declares treason to be a crime. And the definition there is whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, is guilty of treason, and shall suffer death or shall be imprisoned not less than 5 years and fined under this title, but not less than $10,000, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. So although treason has been a crime since the early days of the nation, again, few have been convicted of this offense because there are some hurdles that are necessary in order to prosecute that type of a case. Well, now we're going to get to this phrase, this term called sedition. And sedition, also talked about in Chapter 10, is the act of inciting violence or insurrection against a government. Sedition has been a crime in the United States since the Allen and Sedition Acts of the late 1700s. Now, the 4 laws that made up the Allen and Sedition Acts were enacted by a Federalist-controlled Congress and signed into law by President John Adams during a war with France. And they prohibited the publication of false, scandalous, and malicious stories about the government, and they were used to silence members of the increasingly popular Republican Party, which opposed the anti-French positions of the Federalists. And many opposed the Allen and Sedition Acts as violation of the First Amendment and as infringing on the 10th Amendment authority of the states to regulate such conduct. So sedition is the act of inciting violence or insurrection against a government. And again, the laws that exist today include the general prohibition of seditious conspiracies and the Logan Act, which we'll talk about in a minute, which prohibits individuals from engaging in diplomacy with foreign governments. So that's the definition of sedition. And if you need a little bit more and you want to look it up, You can find it under U.S. Code Title 18 under Section 2384. And sedition is also the act, again, kind of going through it a little bit, of violence or, again, insurrection against the government, and other related crimes that fall underneath that are things like espionage or what we would call subversive conduct. And take the case of Edward Snowden. Now, we know that he was involved in, and I'm not going to get into the great debate on all the WikiLeaks and everything else that has come out, but we know that a lot of people view him as treasonous for his role in the release of what the government felt was protected information. So this is someone that we can kind of look at for an example on, or a case study, if you will, to really think about, hey, was this guy guilty of treason for releasing certain information? So think about it. He was a if you don't know who he was an American computer professor, former CIA employee, and a former contractor for the United States government. And again, what he did is he copied, or at least he was accused of copying and leaking quite a bit of classified information. So we're not going to debate the fact, but I just wanted you to know that this is a good example of, is this treasonous, or does it fall under the realm of things like espionage or subversive conduct? So let's talk a little bit about some of the terrorism laws. The federal government and the governments of all states have certain terrorism laws. As mentioned, acts of terrorism usually involve crimes against people and crimes against property. But terrorism is more than just an attack on an individual or a person's property. It truly is an attack on a government using people or property as tools. So there are, again, many statutes defining the authority and responsibilities of law enforcement officers and agencies that investigate, prevent, and prosecute acts of terrorism. And there are also many types of terrorism. Federal terrorism laws distinguish international terrorism from other forms of terrorism. And the primary terrorism statute, which is 18 U.S.C. 2331, is the section that defines and distinguishes international and domestic terrorism. And we're not going to go through all those. I gave you the definition of what international terrorism is and what domestic terrorism is. So again, we're not going to walk through all of those because we don't have the time to do it. But I am going to talk about very quickly some definitions of other types of terrorism, because remember, as I mentioned, there are other types of terrorism that are out there. So first we have cyber terrorism, which is terrorism that initiates or threatens to initiate the exploitation of or attack on computer systems. And we have agroterrorism, which is an attack on agricultural systems, and bioterrorism. This is terrorism that involves such biological weapons of mass destruction and anthrax and botulism and smallpox. Narcoterrorism. This refers to the use of terrorist attacks to support drug operations or to finance terrorism. And then ecoterrorism. These are acts of violence committed to support ecological or environmental causes. So before we get into this particular case study, I want to talk a little bit about Well, I'll go back. Let's go ahead and do the case study first. So from everything that's listed in the code that I gave you, the Title 18 USC 2331, those things that define and distinguish international and domestic terrorism, from all of those and other different laws, the following common elements of the crime of terrorism can be extracted. So we have these different things. The first would be the commission of an already established crime. The second, the intent to coerce a population or influence a government, and the final one, through intimidation or fear. Now, on June 17th, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof attended a prayer service at the Emmanuel African Methodist Church, a historically African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina. Let me put up his other picture here. Now, Roof, who was not a member of the church, and he was white, sat there for a bit, and then he pulled out a handgun, killing 9 people. And when he was arrested, he allegedly stated that his motive was race. And the reason I showed you this particular case law is I want you to understand that a lot of times we use terrorism in the wrong context, because it's easy to say that any major issue that comes up could be an act of terrorism. And yes, there are different types, but in this particular case, a lot of people wanted a terrorism charge to be filed against Roof. However, because he said that it was race, there was no real evidence to show that it was in fact fell under that terrorism statute. Again, remember, commission of an already established crime, intended to coerce a population or influence a government through intimidation or fear. And then if you go back and look at the FBI's definition, so there wasn't enough to do that. Now, there certainly were murder charges, and it certainly fell into the realm of a hate crime because he said it was race. But that's just to show you the difference sometimes where we tend to not properly use the phrase terrorism. So kind of moving on, let's look at a couple of different codes or different laws that have been put into place to deal with these things that we call terrorism. So in addition to defining the crime of terrorism, there are many statutes defining the authority and responsibilities of law enforcement officers and agencies that investigate, prevent, and prosecute acts of terrorism. And in some cases, terrorism law is embedded in a statute that addresses a different subject. Now, one of the most significant federal laws is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, and for short they call it FISA. Now, FISA stands apart from other federal criminal laws because it recognizes the special nature of foreign intelligence work. So again, the FISA law in 1978 was one of the significant federal laws, which basically, as part of it, has a secret court that orders or authorizes foreign surveillance by officers of the U.S., even though such orders would not be permitted in standard criminal cases. So we have some of these laws that give us a little bit more leeway. So let me give you a little bit more understanding here. So under FISA, okay, again, secret court orders authorizing foreign surveillance by officers of the United States are permitted, even though such orders would not be permitted in standard criminal cases within the United States. Now, the rationale for the distinction is that such orders are not intended to further a prosecution, but to advance the gathering of foreign intelligence needed to protect the nation. Now, recent revelations of metadata collection by federal officials of people in the United States under FISA have resulted in some controversy, both among the public and in Congress, because again, there's the Fourth Amendment that's out there about unreasonable search and seizure, and that would include the seizure of intel and metadata and other types of personal information about people. So you could see how this actually could be a little bit controversial. So by definition, the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, is the primary federal statute governing the collection of foreign intelligence by federal law enforcement agencies. And significant amendments to FISA were passed in 2001 through the U.S. Patriot Act and again in 2008. And we'll talk in just a couple of seconds about the U.S. Patriot Act. Well, another important law is the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. And yes, everything has an acronym. So this is the ADPA. Now, this statute was enacted in response to the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah building, the federal building in Oklahoma City back in 1995. And this act amended existing laws to limit federal habeas corpus, and I'll define that in a second, relief in two different ways. First, it limited the time for filing to 1 year. And second, it limited the total number of petitions that may be filed in a single case. It also mandated closed-circuit television access for victims in cases in which the trial venue is changed. Now, habeas corpus basically means literally that you have the body. And this is a writ. And it's a writ challenging the legality of incarceration. Or, in other words, it's a writ ordering a prisoner to be brought before the court to determine the legality of the prisoner's detention. So this is a very important law that came on the books, and you can probably see why. And next we have the U.S. Patriot Act. So in response to the attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001, Congress enacted the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. Wow, that's a mouthful. But it's, if we kind of jam that all down, it's really known as the USA Patriot Act. And the act, which was reauthorized in 2006, amended many existing laws, including FISA, which we talked about, and also the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986. And if you look on page 410 in your book, it talks about all of the changes that were listed. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of those changes. I'll let you look at those on your own. I just want you to know the big definitions of, what is the FISA Act and what is habeas corpus and what is the USA Patriot Act. So those are the big things, but keep that in mind that you really need to go through and look at those definitions. So again, on October 26th, 2001, President George Bush signed into law the Patriot Act. And remember, it's got that long name, Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, or the Patriot Act. And in a nutshell, what it really does is it gave law enforcement the ability to search, detain, or eavesdrop in pursuit of terrorists. to some level to where we wouldn't be able to do the same thing if we were working as I guess a regular police officer, if that's the best way to put it. And when the USA Patriot Act expired, because it did expire, it had a sunset clause, but when it expired in June of 2015, it was then replaced by something called the USA Freedom Act, which had similar elements as well, but did change a couple of things. And again, I'm not going to go through each one of those little changes, but I just wanted you to know the information. So, enacted on June 2nd, 2015, it restored and basically modified in form some of the provisions of the Patriot Act. And really what it did is it kind of imposed some limitation on the bulk collection of telecommunication or cell phone metadata. And I have a couple links in there that you can look at your leisure that are videos that talk about the USA Patriot Act and also that talk about the Freedom Act. So you can look at those again on at your leisure. So in combating terrorism, and now we're going to kind of move into some constitutional issues. In combating terrorism, the government's focus is as much on prevention as it is on prosecution. And I put up the logos of a couple of different agencies that are involved. Now, every police department is involved, and really the first responders, the patrol officers, they are the backbone, if you will, on recognizing issues relating to terrorism and assisting in solving some crimes. But let's talk a little bit more about the constitutional issues. So although this is a lecture on criminal law, not criminal procedure, several important constitutional criminal procedure issues resulted from, or they result from, the war on terror. They really should be talked about. Now, in response, again, to the attacks on September 11th, the USA Patriot Act was enacted. And President Bush immediately took military action. Now, the latter included issuing Military Order Number 1, which authorized the Secretary of Defense to detain members of Al-Qaeda who were suspected of planning or participating in terrorism against the United States. Now, President Bush also provided for the establishment of military tribunals, courts, to try suspected terrorists. Now, consequently, the Secretary of Defense issued Military Commission Order Number 1, which elaborated on the president's order, and this order set out the procedures to be used by military tribunals, provided for forfeiture of property by convicted terrorists, and established death as one possible punishment for convicted terrorists. So, we have to keep in mind there are some constitutional issues as we're talking about terrorist issues. So the social costs of not detecting and preventing terrorism are more akin to the damages inflicted by war than the cost associated with traditional crimes. That is, hundreds, if not thousands, can lose their lives in a single terrorist incident. Property damage can be extraordinary, and the potential for lasting damage can be or is significant. And other constitutional issues are beginning to surface on the war on terror, in particular the expanded surveillance and investigative authorities of law enforcement, both at home and abroad. They do tend to raise some privacy concerns. And, under the USA Patriot Act, federal law enforcement agencies possess the authority to issue an administrative subpoena to service providers demanding to see individual files without probable cause, as long as the data is relevant to a national security investigation. So remember, we're talking about these constitutional issues relating to the war on terrorism. So let's look at a case to kind of bring a little context to what we're talking about. In 2013, the DC Metro Police Department used what they call a stingray to track a suspect's cell phone while investigating several sexual assaults and robberies, but officers did not obtain a warrant or any other court order before using the device. Now, through the use of that stingray device, police were able to precisely locate the suspect. Prince Jones was his name, sitting in his parked car on a busy street. Now, the defense challenged the stingray's use before trial, and the lower court found that even if the police actions violated the Fourth Amendment's reasonable search and seizure clause, the evidence found in the car could still be used under what they call the inevitable discovery doctrine. And we're not going to go through all that. I'm just laying this out as a foundation for some information. Now, on appeal, the defense argued that police should be required to get a warrant before using a stingray because the device can locate people's cell phones with great precision, including inside of homes and other private spaces that are protected by the Fourth Amendment. And further, stingrays, the device can sweep information about not just a suspect's cell phone, but bystanders' phones as well. So I have a picture, I think, in here. Well, first let me get to the ruling. So the DC Court of Appeals agreed here in a 2-to-1 ruling and basically said this: holding that the Fourth Amendment protects against warrantless use of invasive covert technology to track people's phones, we applaud today's opinion for erecting sensible and strong protections against the government violating people's privacy in the digital age. So, but let me show you the photo. So here's how a stingray works. And think about this as we think about the right to privacy, along with or in conjunction with our pursuit on terrorism. So when the device is turned on, it basically simulates a cell tower. It pretends like it's a cell tower. So instead of all the cell phone stuff going to the cell tower, it simulates it and it comes over here to the person running the machine. So it forces cell phones in the area to register over here. Now, the phones don't have to be in use, and the mobile phones then transmit their phone numbers and their unique electronic serial numbers to the stingray instead of here. So it doesn't just maybe get the suspect, it'll pick up other people's locations as well, and that was the rationale for that particular case. And if you want a little bit more information relating to cases on cell phones, there's a really, really good one right here, Carpenter versus United States. And again, it's a similar case to the one that I just read, so I would suggest that you take a look at that one. So let me finish up with just a couple things. So in combating terrorism, again, the government's focus is as much on prevention as it is on prosecution and punishment. And this is because the social costs, again, of not detecting and preventing terrorism are more akin to the damages inflicted by war than the cost associated with traditional crimes. That is, hundreds, if not thousands, can lose their lives on a single terrorist incident. So let me give you just one or two more cases, and then we'll move on to the next thing. The Supreme Court has said that deference to the executive in terrorism cases may be justified. And the Supreme Court's decision in recent years have begun to contour to this largely underdeveloped area of law. Now, the first decision of the court addressed the detention of suspected terrorists. Now, there's a case in Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, a U.S. citizen who also held Saudi Arabian citizenship, was seized in Afghanistan by U.S. allies and turned over to U.S. authorities, who detained him in several locations, including Guantanamo Bay and a naval jail in Virginia. The United States claimed that he was an unlawful combatant, as defined by law, who was waging war on the United States, and that accordingly he could be detained without hearing or trial. Now, Hamdi's father filed a habeas corpus. Remember that writ that basically brings the person before the court and asks the question, why are you being detained? Petition on the son's behalf, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court. So the court held that the 14th Amendment's due process protections applied to citizen detainees, and that Hamdi was entitled to a hearing to determine if cause existed to support the finding that he was in fact an unlawful combatant. And although the court held that he had the right to counsel, it also held that access to judicial review is not required by the Due Process Clause. Rather, access to an impartial fact finder, even if military, is adequate. So you can see a lot of the issues relating to constitutional issues, detainments, eavesdropping, surveillance, and all of those things that we've kind of talked about. These are really things to kind of keep in mind as we talk about issues related to terrorism. Well, now let's turn our attention to human trafficking and human smuggling. So, according to the United Nations, or the UN, another acronym, human smuggling and trafficking in persons are two of the fastest growing areas of international criminal activity today. There are important distinctions that must be made between these two forms of crime, if you will. So, following federal law, the U.S. State Department defines human smuggling as the facilitation, transportation, attempted transportation, or illegal entry of persons across an international border in violation of one or more countries' laws, either clandestinely, secretly, or through deception, such as the use of fraudulent documents. So, in other words, human smuggling refers to illegal immigration in which an agent is paid to help a person cross a border secretly or clandestinely, which is kind of secretly. And human smuggling may be conducted to obtain financial or other benefits for the smuggler, although sometimes people engage in smuggling for other motives, like to reunite with their families. And again, here we're talking about law. We're not going to debate the immigration issue. So I'm just going to kind of go over those things that deal strictly with the law. So with that being said, human smuggling generally occurs with the consent of those being smuggled. And again, they often pay a smuggler for his or her services. And once inside the country, they usually have no further contact with the smuggler. Now, that's not always the case, but typically. And the vast majority of people who are assisted in illegally entering the U.S. are smuggled rather than trafficked. Now remember, we're splitting hairs because we're talking about laws. Okay, so I just kind of want everybody to understand the difference between some of these things. Now, I have a little diagram here that talks about the difference between trafficking and smuggling as it relates to human trafficking or human smuggling. And this is something that was put out by the Department of Homeland Security, their Blue campaign, to let everybody know the difference between the two. They're telling us that these are not interchangeable terms. Smuggling is transportation based and trafficking is exploitation based. So I'll let you can look at those definitions on your own, but just there's a little bit of good information from Homeland Security. So on the other hand, trafficking, in contrast to smuggling, trafficking in persons, and they call it TIP, and yes, there's another acronym, is a modern day form of slavery, prompting former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to say that defeating human trafficking is a great moral calling of our day. Trafficking involves the exploitation of unwilling or unwitting people through force, coercion, threat, or even deception. And it includes human rights abuses such as debt bondage, meaning like they're going to keep you in captivity, if you will, until you work off your debt. Deprivation of liberty, or lack of control over freedom and labor. And trafficking is often undertaken for the purpose of sexual or labor exploitation. And women and children tend to comprise the largest group of victims, and they are often physically and emotionally abused. So we've kind of gone through that. Now, trafficking is often an international crime that involves crossing the border, but it is important to note that victims can be trafficked within their own countries and communities. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go along. Traffickers can move victims between locations within the same country and often sell them to other trafficking organizations. So again, and to finish up, some trafficking victims may believe they are being smuggled when they are actually really being trafficked, but they're unaware of their fate, if you will. Now, the distinct differences, I showed you the little flyer that was put out by the Department of Homeland Security, but the distinctions between smuggling and trafficking are sometimes very subtle, but key components that generally distinguish trafficking from smuggling are the elements of fraud, force, or even coercion. Now, however, under U.S. law, if the person is under 18 and induced to perform a commercial sex act, then it is considered trafficking regardless of whether there's fraud, force, or coercion, etc. And there's a really good table or diagram, if you will, on page 419 in your textbook that shows the difference between human trafficking and smuggling. And so if you have a chance, I would suggest that you look at that, because it really is a good diagram to kind of, you can see the differences between the two. Now, often, again, human trafficking and smuggling have the same underlying conditions, including extreme poverty, lack of economic opportunity, civil unrest, and political uncertainty. So these are some of the underlying conditions in which people may want to leave where they're at, which subsequently gets them into the pipeline of either smuggling or trafficking. Now, as far as legislation goes, one of the first comprehensive pieces of federal immigration legislation was the 1924 Immigration Act. And some points to cover: it limited the number of immigrants who could be admitted from any one country to 2% of the number of people from that country who are already living in the United States. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 established the Immigration and Naturalization Service, called the INS. And the INA provided criminal penalties for anyone bringing or attempting to bring unauthorized aliens into the United States. So again, these are some federal immigration and trafficking legislation efforts. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, passed by Congress on October 28, 2000, to recognize human smuggling and human trafficking as a serious social issue. And again, there's an acronym for everything. So the TVPA is a comprehensive statute that addresses these significant problems of trafficking of persons for the purpose of subjecting them to commercial sex acts or forced labor. And the TVPA defines severe forms of trafficking as follows. So sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. Now, under the TVPA, again, human trafficking does not require the crossing of an international border, nor does it even require the transportation of victims from one locale to another. And this is because the victims of severe forms of trafficking are not always illegal aliens. They may be U.S. citizens, legal residents, or even visitors. And so another one is the Homeland Security Act of 2002. This basically dissolved the INS and transferred most of its functions to the Department of Homeland Security. And 3 branches exist today in place of INS. You have the Citizenship and Immigration Services. You have the Customs and Border Protection. And then you finally have Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE. Now, in 2014, the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act was signed into law. And this law requires state child welfare agencies to identify and provide assistance to children who have been trafficked or who are at risk of being trafficked, and to promote normalcy in foster care and adoption. A couple of more. Section 7202 of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 established the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center within the U.S. State Department. And the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and members of the national intelligence community, they oversee the center. And it was created to achieve greater integration and overall effectiveness in the U.S. government's enforcement of issues relating to human smuggling and trafficking. So I know that was a lot to cover. And again, we just touched the tip of the iceberg on a lot of these things. But again, we dealt specifically with some of the laws relating to terrorism, and we talked a little bit about treason, and we talked a little bit, of course, about the constitutional issues relating to the fight on terrorism, and then we talked about other things relating to smuggling and trafficking and some of the federal immigration and trafficking legislation laws that have been put forth to help make these things better for those that somehow and unfortunately get sucked up into them. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our lecture for chapter 12. Again, please, at the end of the chapter, take the time to look at the summary and also look at the definitions page, either in Canvas or those that are listed in your textbook. So again, that will conclude our chapter 12 lecture, and until next time.